Hello and welcome to a class on the Nazi state, which I will sometimes refer to as the Nazis in power. This is the kind of next section of our study of Nazism, and this is a fairly kind of detailed section of the course where we will look at a number of different groups, a number of different Nazi policies. We'll look at Nazi ideology, we'll look at Nazi propaganda, we'll look at the Nazi, the kind of early kind of beginnings of Nazi kind of treatment of the Jews. So there's quite a lot that we're going to kind of squeeze into this this kind of topic or period, if you like. Now the Nazi state, as you know, begins really once the Nazis have consolidated their power, which is in 1933 or 1934 if you want to argue that it happens after Hindenburg dies, and it carries on right through until the war ends. I mean, that is the Nazi state, right through until 1945. But for the purposes of what we are doing in this, or for this topic, I'm really going to try and curtail the Nazi state to the pre-war state. So we're really looking at 1933 until 1939. We might kind of drift into the war years, but on the whole, I want to kind of look at what the Nazi state was like, who benefited, who did not benefit, before we get to this kind of obviously very different type of Germany once the war begins, because the Nazi state has to adapt, like every other country has to adapt to wartime conditions, even if those wartime conditions were created by the Nazis themselves. So they were to some extent prepared for war, but things do change post 1939. We will examine some of these changes once we study the Holocaust. Now, when we examine this topic, I want to really think about two questions. I want you to think about kind of two questions. These questions are connected to each other, and if you can answer these questions, then you can start to get a better understanding of what life was like under Nazi rule, during the Nazi period. Some groups are going to benefit more than others, right? So I'm going to come to that point. The first question I want you to think about is, to what extent was the Nazi regime based on popular support? Now, what we mean by this is, was the Nazi regime based on Nazi policies that were popular? Were they based on things that the Nazis did for the country, even if it's a simple thing like instilling pride back within the nation because it appeared that Germany was no longer surrendering to the terms of Versailles, right? So was there a kind of positive reason as to why people enjoyed living under the Nazis? Or did people not give their popular support for the regime, but they accepted and tolerated Nazism because they had no choice, i.e. they were subjected to terror and repression and propaganda, and it was all of these things that helped keep the regime orderly and helped maintain Hitler's position of power. So that's the first question. Is the regime based on popular support, or is it based on terror and coercion? Now, you know that no answer in history is ever as straightforward as one thing or the other. Therefore, there's a more nuanced argument, right? So the next question I want you to think about is this more nuanced argument. And therefore, the question is, which groups do well under the Nazis? If some groups do better than others, then you could argue that some segments of the population give their consent to the regime based on popular support. They like what is happening, they like how they themselves might be benefiting from Nazi rule. But there are other groups who will not do so well. Now, obviously there's the obvious groups, right? Minorities, and the Jews are the main victims of Nazism, as you all know. But there are other parts of the German population who are not going to do as well under the Nazis as they had done so under the Weimar Republic, and these groups could, or it could be argued, because of their kind of political, ideological background, political views of members of these groups, these groups could argue that they're not giving their popular support to the regime. The reason why they accept Nazism is because they have no choice. It's all about terror and coercion. If they speak out, if they complain, then they will experience significant, serious repercussions. So, to summarise, was the regime based on consent or coercion? It might be therefore based on consent for some groups, the middle classes perhaps, the wealthy, big business, those who might refer to themselves as being German nationalists, but it's not beneficial to the working class and maybe to a lesser extent Catholics, but definitely for Jews. So we're going to have to look at all of these groups and maybe start to think, okay, why do some groups do well under the Nazis? Why are they compliant? Why do they accept Nazism? Why do other groups basically keep their mouth shut and accept Nazism? We will eventually get to the question of resistance and opposition to the Nazis. That's still a while away yet before we touch on that. But when groups do oppose the Nazi regime, it probably is because they're ideologically opposed to the Nazis. Now, in this topic, some of what we'll cover today, some of what we'll cover in subsequent lessons, and what you will examine on My City, you'll get a chance to look at different groups and different ways of trying to determine if the population did benefit from Nazi rule. So we're going to look at the Nazi economy. That's our focus in this lecture. And as you look at the Nazi economy, you can start to think about, okay, did some social groups do better than others? Did some occupations do better than others? Then we'll break that down again in a future lesson. The next lesson we'll look at the working class. So some of what I'll talk about today is directly linked to the working class, but we'll have a separate lesson on the working class, very short lesson, just to try and kind of establish exactly why they did or did not benefit from Nazi rule. So the Nazi economy, what we're going to cover today, will cover all social groups and classes, as well the My City activity related to it. Then we'll look at the working class and how the Nazis tried to appeal to the working classes to support and accept the regime. Then we'll look at women, then we'll look at children. As I said, we'll touch on other groups like the industrialist class, the middle classes, peasants, as you complete some of the online activities. And then the final factor we're going to look at, state repression, which focuses on propaganda and terror. There is an argument that all Germans, all social classes are affected directly by propaganda and the threat of terror. Now, except again, some groups are going to be subjected more to terror than others, right? So when we look at concentration camps and who were the main sections of the population who found themselves thrown into these camps, well, it tended to be the working classes who were associated with the Socialist Party or the Communist Party. It tended to be women, perhaps, who were feminists. It would be people who were ideologically opposite, if you like, to what the Nazis, what Nazism stood for. So even when we get to state repression and propaganda, although we can say the entire population is affected by this, because nobody can speak out against Nazism, your freedom of speech, your liberties, which were part of the Weimar Constitution, have now been removed. There are some groups who are definitely treated much more severely by government apparatus, state apparatus, than others. And again, we tend to see the working class, especially if they are politically to the left, who are going to be more affected by the Nazi state repression than other groups. Okay, let's focus on the Nazi economy. Let's say that you were being asked a question about who did benefit from the Nazi regime and who didn't benefit. Just looking at the economy as a starting off point, you can start to get some evidence that will help you answer that question. So although the next class that we're going to have, separate lecture, will touch on the working class and the extent to which they did benefit or did not benefit under Nazi rule, the very first example I'm going to look at today is going to focus on the working classes. And there's a historian that I want to refer to, a historian that you've already been introduced to via one of the documentaries that you've watched, British historian, expert on Nazism, Richard Evans. And Evans tells the story of this picture. This picture here is Hitler, obviously, digging in the mud, and the question is, what is he doing? Why are there cameras there? Why are so many high-ranked Nazi members and military men surrounding him? What is the propaganda purpose, if you like, of this picture? Because we can all pretty much assume that Hitler is not here to do a full day's work. This is a photo opportunity. Okay, here is the story, roughly based on what Evans says. Right, I'm going to paraphrase him slightly, but Evans says that this here is a picture Taken late September 1933, so very early on in the Nazi regime. The location is Frankfurt. What happens on the morning of this late September 1933 is there are 700 unemployed men in Frankfurt, and remember, unemployment rates at this point are 6 million within Germany. And they've been turning up to the labour exchange, i.e. the job centre, regularly. But on this day they are told that they now have work, right? They're going to become part of a 300,000 strong army of road workers. These men were going to be employed on the new autobahns, and the autobahns are obviously the German version of motorways. These men swore an oath to the Führer, and they were all presented with shovels for the march from the centre of Frankfurt to their new workplace on the outskirts of Frankfurt, where they would start the process of building a motorway. Hitler flies in to Frankfurt on this very day, and when he arrives, he's taken in his car to the site of where this new motorway is going to be built. He is given a spade, and he starts to dig, right? He does so for a few moments, for pictures to be taken. Hitler starts to sweat a little bit, giving the impression that he is obviously a hard-working male, just like these working class unemployed men. And then Hitler gives a speech, right? Now this is obviously a piece of propaganda, right? It's a piece of Nazi propaganda, and the speech that comes with it is the usual rhetoric and lies that you get from Hitler. So he says, I'm not going to read it all, but I'll give you the main points, right? He says, workers, I myself was often attacked for my origins during the period of my struggle for power in Germany by those who pretended to represent the interests of the workers. So he's having a dig here at the trade unions. At that time, people were fond of saying, what does that ex-construction worker and painter want? And these were jobs that Hitler had had. I am happy and proud that the fate forced me to tread this path. In this way, perhaps I have gained a greater understanding for the German worker. So the fact that Hitler himself regards his previous experience working as a construction worker, he thinks he's now in touch, or he is able to be in touch with the working class in Germany. And he then says he can understand the German working man's character, but also his suffering. He then goes on to say that this new German nation, right, so the kind of rebirth of Germany that comes with Hitler and the Nazis, is going to be a Germany which is built on the value of work, that everybody should work, and people can take great pride in their work. The way that you can truly rebuild a country is to get these 6 million unemployed men back working, even if the job that they are doing might not be the greatest, it might not be the most skilled, it might not be the most well paid, it at least instills pride within this worker. And that was really what Hitler's intention was, because people were so depressed, were so down with the economic conditions that Germany had experienced really since the Great Depression had begun, post Wall Street crash, that Hitler just believed, or Hitler and other Nazis believed, that just a little bit of work would be enough to boost the self-confidence of an individual, and hence the self-confidence of the entire nation. Now, this propaganda here would be one which, a kind of propaganda message that would kind of last for a long time, even something which historians themselves were kind of convinced by, that here is the reason as to why unemployment in Germany fell dramatically. This is why German unemployment at 6 million starts to come down, because workers are now being employed in building roads. Now that very first statistic that I gave you suggested that 300,000 men were going to work on the construction of autobahns. The figure never really gets to that point. I'm going to quote Evans again here. This is from page 241 of his book on the Third Reich. He says, in 1936, so we're fast forwarding 3 years, he says an all-time maximum of 120,000 workers were employed constructing the autobahns. Put differently, only 4 to 5% of the 6 million unemployed in 1933 were employed building motorways. Even if you add the ancillary industries that are all kind of linked to motorway construction, it still has a fairly limited impact on reducing the unemployment figures. The other thing I just want to touch on very quickly, this is more relevant to what you'll look at in the next lecture, but this also comes from Evans, so it's worthwhile just looking at now. Evans says, These workers do not have a particularly good way of working, right? Their conditions are actually pretty poor. They might have a job, but what really is this job to them? And what Evans says is, he says, the idea that when you've got 6 million unemployed, you have to have good conditions and high pay is just not going to be the case, because there's a large pool of labourers who are willing to take any job, right? So you can get away with treating them poorly. And these road builders would often work between 12 to 16 hours a day. And by that, it's not even including the amount of time it would take them to get to their work. And remember, working on a motorway, unless you're living on site, which is not the case always, you've got quite a far distance to travel to your work. These 700 men from Frankfurt have got a bit of a walk there and back to their place of employment. There was very little kind of joy within working in these places. Some of the men who did stay there were housed in kind of poor little shacks, obviously detached from their family. Not only was the pay rather poor, as I mentioned, but they had to work under any weather conditions, and I guess they were also working in a place that was quite dangerous, and many workers were obviously killed in the process of building these roads. If workers started to express their unhappiness with how they were being treated working on the autobahns, if they spoke out, then what you would see is the coercive aspect of the state. So the unemployed who refused to work on the motorways had their benefits terminated, or were threatened to be threatened with the likelihood that they'd be sent to a concentration camp. The SA would often get involved as well, and would use their intimidation and threats of violence to try and keep these workers in their place. So, great piece of propaganda for Hitler and the Nazis. But the question is, did it lead to a significant reduction in unemployment, and did it lead to an improvement for the working class? Here is the kind of key question here. If you're unemployed and have zero income, is any job better than no job? The Nazi perspective was that any job was better than no job. Workers may have disagreed with this. Okay, I just want to move away a little bit from that one particular story, but I think it's a good story to kind of introduce you to the economic situation within Germany and the policies that the Nazis would start to implement, and how these policies were often connected to propaganda. I want to move away from that and look at the bigger picture. The bigger picture for Germany in 1933, when Hitler comes to office, in terms of the economy, is there's two elements to it. Obviously, unemployment is ridiculously high, right? 6 million. Working out at roughly 1 in 3 of the workforce unemployed. 1 in 3 men, that is. At the same time, you've got a weak economy because Germany isn't really producing or creating anything, and therefore can't export whatever she creates. So the entire world's economy has been affected by the Great Depression. We shouldn't be surprised, therefore, that Germany has been, incredibly badly affected by the Depression. Therefore, her economy just in general needs to be revitalised. The individual who was tasked with trying to improve the situation was Hjalmar Schacht. His name is here. You can read a bit more about Hjalmar Schacht on My City. There's a little link where you can read a little bio about him. But he was a fairly conservative economics kind of financial expert. He obviously helped Hitler come to power, hence why he gets this job. The kind of mid-1930s, you might call these the short-term goals, if you like, after reducing unemployment, was to kind of rebuild the economy. And one of the ways of rebuilding the economy, i.e. getting people back into work, would be through the Public Works Programme, and that Public Works Programme is the building of the autobahns. But when you've got 6 million unemployed and you're only really covering 120,000, these autobahns are not really doing what the propaganda might suggest they're doing. What really does start to bring down unemployment is rearmament, which is listed below Public Works. And the building of ships, or aircraft, or tanks, often this was done kind of in a clandestine manner at first, because, as you know, the Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from rearming, but Hitler takes absolutely zero notice of this. the kind of rearmament process and conscription, so that's workers, middle classes becoming possibly members of the army. That's going to reduce unemployment as well. And then as we get to the 1930s, kind of drawing to a close, the German economy, this is under the kind of leadership of Hermann Göring, the German economy goes into a war footing, or what we might call autarky. Autarky just means self-sufficiency, right? So the German economy wishes to be self-sufficient. Why is that the case? Well, they were not self-sufficient during World War One, and one of the reasons, according to Hitler, that they lost World War One was because they couldn't cope domestically with the kind of shortages that come through war. So autarky means self-sufficiency, and that is not just in terms of food, but also war materials. So when you get in Germany in the 1930s, chemical companies and manufacturing companies are creating things that never really existed before within Germany in an attempt to ensure that Germany could sustain herself during a long conflict. Now, the kind of shift towards a war economy will have a knock-on effect on a whole range of things, the standard of living being one of them. We'll cover that in the next lecture when we look at what we call the KDF, right? So we'll come back to that, okay? But this is just a kind of overview of what the Nazis and Hitler stood for. In the little image, you can see a new ship being launched by the Nazis. The problem, I guess, the Nazis had initially was they didn't want to tell the rest of the world that this is what they were doing, because it did go against the terms of Versailles. But by 1935, actually, the Nazis had signed a naval agreement with the British, which basically said as long as the British were happy that the Nazis or the Germans were not producing more than 3/5 of the British ships, then the British didn't have to worry, because they would always have that military/naval superiority. What the Nazis were doing was building partly to reduce unemployment, but they also are building a war machine that they intend to use. We'll need to come back to that point as well. That will have certain ramifications. There is a little video that you can watch in your own time, only the last few minutes. You can access it via this web presentation. But really what the video was asking is one key question. Was the Nazi economy and the reduction in unemployment and the jobs that were created, did this lead to what is referred to as a Wirtschaftswunder, right? An economic miracle. And therefore, could this economic miracle be attributed to Hitler? Well, historians are sceptical. They do think that Hitler and the Nazis, with some of their public works programs and with their rearmament, but mostly with them kind of rewriting how you would define unemployment. Well, unemployment is reduced, right? Is that enough to say there was an economic miracle? Well, I'm not so sure about that, and that's what we're going to explore right now. To do so, we're going to look at some primary sources, and we're going to start to think about what actually goes on within Germany during the 1930s to take the country away from a period of economic despair to a much more positive outlook in the late 1930s. Although, as I've already said, much of the success can be attributed to the militarisation of the country and the preparation for war. Here in source 1 you can see some statistics. It's quite small, but you can see that in 1933, when Hitler comes to power, the unemployment rate in January of 1933 is roughly 6 million. If you take the kind of very final date on the graph, 1939, July, this is right before World War II begins. Population is actually increasing during this time. The unemployment rate has dropped, right? So 6 million within 5 or 6 years, it's now down to 38,000. So it's a remarkable turnaround, right? The Nazis have basically found 6 million jobs, or have they? Right, that's what we'll come to again in a minute. So possibly economic miracle, right? Based on source 1. Source 2, the Nazis and or Germany and Britain's comparative military expenditure as a percentage of gross national product, right? So all the wealth in the country, how much of all the wealth that exists in Britain or all the wealth that exists in Germany, how much of that was spent on military goods. Well, you can see that Britain are way behind, right? The reason therefore that this is a useful graph is not really because we can make any real comparisons with Britain. It just tells us that the Nazis have already started the process as early as 1935, right, where they are spending 8%, that goes up to 17%. In 1938, when they're spending 17% of their GNP on military equipment, and that tells us that yes, they may be reducing unemployment, but they are also maybe perhaps preparing for something else. And the argument might go that maybe the Nazis were planning a war. War would bring success, war would bring territories, and war would bring money from other countries that could then be used to pay off Nazi war debts. And Britain does eventually catch up in 1939, but that gap that we see gives the Nazis obviously a lot of advantage in the war. Not that we are going to be looking at the war in any detail, right? We're not so interested in what happens militarily on the battlefields during the war. Source 3, also useful because it tells us about national income. It's about the amount of money coming into Germany. We can see that in 1933 is 44,000. It has almost doubled by the time we get to 1938. Why is national income greater now than it has ever been before? Well, Germany's making things and they're exporting goods around the world. As they export goods around the world, more currency, more money comes into the country, okay? The next set of sources I want to look at, source 4 through to source 7, are really just kind of try to make the same point again, right, that the country's becoming a bit more wealthy. The interesting thing about source 4 is it actually tells us that wages drop, so there might be more money in the country, but there is actually a drop in the amount of that money being used as wages, right? So in 1933, the percentage of national income that was used as wages to be spent on working class, middle classes is 63%, it's down to 57% by 1938, and that tells us that less money has been given out, and therefore there's less money for working people to spend. Source 5 is a really interesting source because it gives us a little insight into what working class families spent under the Weimar Republic compared to what they spent under the Nazi regime. Now I'm not going to go through all of these items on a shopping list, but there are some standout examples here that tell us that in spite of the economic success, the reduction in unemployment, the rebuilding of the German economy, there is a knock-on effect, and the knock-on effect is on the standard of living of working class families, right? So you can see in 1927 that working class families were able to consume a decent amount of meat and alcohol, right? So you see at the very bottom, beer in litres consumed stands at 76.5%. That's under the Weimar regime. It has dropped by more than half to 31.6% by 1937. That's kind of remarkable, right? If you look at meat and meat products, it's 133.7 kilograms in 1927. This drops to 109 kilograms by 1937. Now, there is an element of the Nazi regime that really, dislikes the idea of the working class drinking. So there might be that reason for the number dropping. Working class people are also working longer hours, so there's less time to drink and less time to socialise. Life under the Nazis is more regulated, so there's less drinking taking place as well, and working class families can't meet up for political meetings and so on and so forth. So that may be another reason as to why it drops. But it's most likely to do with the fact that there's just less money available in the family pot to spend on beer, which might have been determined or deemed to be a luxury. And it's the same with meat products as well. Although there was also kind of Nazi propaganda campaign to get people to be more healthy and maybe to eat less meat. It should be said that Hitler was teetotal, didn't drink, so he's not going to encourage the consumption of beer. And both Hitler and Himmler were vegetarians, which again might suggest the reduction in meat. The thing that goes up during this period is the way that bread is consumed. So rye bread increases, wheat bread decreases. Rye bread is not particularly nice. And if you go down the rest of the table, you'll see that that's really the same throughout, except cheese increases a little bit under the Nazis, whereas everything else pretty much drops. So you could argue, based on these statistics, that working class family standard of living deteriorates during the Nazi era. Sources 6 and 7 are just other little examples of Nazi propaganda that Hitler talks about. But in his eyes anyway, this economic miracle, the economic miracle is achieved because of all the construction of autobahns and bridges, and the final source, the amount of houses that the Nazis are building. So that's really what we can take, quite useful quantitative data that tells us that on the one hand it appears that things are improving because unemployment is kind of coming down, right? We know that's 6 million to 38,000, but there are other knock-on effects as a result, and this is the final example I want to just show you at this point. This is the average hours of work per week in the major branches of industry. Now we are only looking to pick out a couple of dates here, right? So these are dates that are I guess one before the Nazis and one whilst the Nazis are in power. So let's take coal mining. Hours worked per week in 1930, before the Nazis come to power, is high, right? It's 40 hours a week. But by 1940, just as war is breaking out, that's up to 47.5. So coal miners, members of the working class, are not doing as well because on average they're working longer, but we can also see that their standard of living is deteriorating as well. Right, we will come back to some of these points when we look at the working class next in the next lesson. Now the next thing I want to do is look at a little kind of sequence of statistics again that will maybe help us determine whether or not there was this Nazi economic miracle. This is just a little article by Karsten Kehl, and he uses this term in the very first section of this extract. He does say, you know, how did the Nazis kind of improve the economy in the 1930s? Is it legitimate to talk about a Wirtschaftswunder, right? That is the term, economic miracle. Did Hitler initiate all of these ideas? Did the Nazis initiate all these ideas so successfully that unemployment was reduced? Well, there is a little bit of a trick, and as always with the Nazis, as is always the case with a number of political movements and governments, unemployment figures are often massaged in such a way that numbers drop, and when numbers drop, it's not necessarily because new jobs have been created. So you've got this key propaganda project, right? The Volksautobahn, right? The motorways. We already know that leads to maybe 120,000 jobs. So that's not a major amount, right? We say that's maybe about 5% of the overall 6 million unemployed within Germany. Unemployment statistics therefore are massaged, right? He uses obviously this guy's first language is not English, right? It's German, so he uses a slightly different phrase for the statistics to be kind of manipulated. But in 1933, a million jobs do, you know, or are created. You get the impression a million jobs are created, but really what you see is a million people who are on unemployment statistics disappear. It doesn't mean that a million jobs have been created, right? One of the reasons as to why unemployment goes from 6 million to under 5 million in that first year is because of Jews being kicked out of their job. Now, there's not that many Jews in Germany as you might first think, right? There's about 500,000 Jews in Germany, and not all of them work because some are children. But you're talking about a few 100,000 possibly, or a couple 100,000 jobs that are going because of this. Not all Jews are kicked out of their jobs right away either, and not all Jews are employed by a company or by the state, right? Many of them have their own businesses. The other reason as to why the unemployment figure drops so quickly is because women are strongly encouraged to leave the job market, and their focus is going to be Heim and Herd, right? House, home, family, and to take on domestic work. So they're not working, but they're no longer counted as unemployed because they are now seen as being, people who are going to work from the home and take on the stereotypical gender role that was expected of women under the Nazis. So you take that into account, right? This Nazi economic miracle might not be as great as you think, right? So you've got women removed, Jews removed, conscription, which puts people into work, but they're now soldiers in the army. You have got another little twist, if you like, from the Nazis, which is to encourage women to take on voluntary work, whether it be in hospitals. Young females are asked to take on voluntary work in schools. Young males are sent out into the countryside to help farmers, but they're not necessarily being paid for it. So the unemployment statistics can come down without necessarily creating lots of jobs. But sometimes the impression is that the Volksautobahn was the main reason, the public work schemes, the building of houses and bridges, of digging ditches, that was the main reason as to why unemployment reduced, but as this article says, that was a myth, maybe even a prevailing myth, that is now obviously started to be challenged by historians. There's one final aspect of this I just want to focus on. The Nazis do spend a lot of money, right? They do obviously spend money on the materials for autobahns, they spend money on materials for building ships and so on and so forth. The question is often asked is, where did the Nazis get this money from? The very final sentence here says, the Nazi state had financed itself by expropriating its own people and exploiting Europe to death, right? Now the first part of that sentence, expropriating its own people, is obviously just what we've spoken about, right? You know, not having an increase in wages, as those statistics have shown, limiting the standard of people's lives, less social life, not buying as much luxury items. So that's a kind of expropriation from its own people. But then the plan the Nazis had was to eventually go to war, because all of this economic model, if you like, is based on war. If you reduce unemployment by conscription, if you reduce unemployment by building ships and tanks and planes, then at some point you're going to have to use these things and go to war, and Hitler had always intended to go to war. The date had not necessarily been determined, but the idea was from 1936 that the Nazis would have a 4-year plan. Hermann Göring, technically Hitler's number 2, was in charge of this 4-year plan. It was preparation for war, right? So maybe 1940 was going to be that ideal year for war. And if Germany were to win this war, successfully conquer other territories, we all know what that entails, right? This concept of Lebensraum, or living space. If that was the case, then the Nazis hoped that it would exploit these European powers, their land, their territories, extract their gold and silver deposits. All of this would be sent back to the Reich. We know this happens when it comes to the treatment of the Jews. When the Jews are removed from Germany and sent east, the belongings, their properties taken from them, and is then controlled by the Nazi state. And even more sinister and horrific is when Jews are sent to their death during the Holocaust. All of their belongings are also extracted from them meticulously and sent back to Germany. In fact, there was a place in Auschwitz-Birkenau that was referred to by inmates as Canada. The reason as to why this part of Auschwitz was known as Canada was because it was the nicest, most desirable bit of the camp. And it was in this so-called Canada that all the belongings, all the valuables, all the money, all the property of the Jews was taken to this part of the camp, and inmates were basically told to go through all of the belongings, sort it. So you take money, put it in the money section, you take valuables, put it in certain section, and so on and so forth. And then all of this would be sent back by the SS, with the exception of the parts that the SS corruptly members took for themselves and stole, even though that was very much something which could lead to them being executed, because Himmler was very clear nobody should personally benefit from the destruction of the Jewish race. And all of this money was sent back to Germany. So the Nazi state finances itself by decreasing the standard of living for its own people, and by exploiting and murdering not just the Jewish people, but also those that they encounter in Poland and those in communist Russia as well. So when you go to the My City activity, what I want you to do is to think about that question again, right? Who benefits from Nazi rule? And the question about who benefits from Nazi rule is, based on what we've looked at so far, and we'll continue this in the next class, is not the working class, right? They might have a job, but what type of job is it? What are their conditions? What is their lifestyle as a result? But the online My City task will also get you to look at, do women benefit? Do industrialists benefit? Do peasants benefit? Do the middle classes benefit? And you can start to come up with hopefully a solution to the question of, was the regime based on popular support, or was it based on terror and coercion? For the working classes, they may argue that they have very little choice but to participate in the regime, and therefore there's a lot of coercion. For those who are doing well, they might not feel that coercion. They might feel that they're doing really well, and therefore they're happy to give their consent to the regime, because the Nazi regime, Nazi policies are to some extent reflecting what the middle classes who voted for the Nazis actually wanted a stronger economy, less social class disputes, the trade union movement weakened, they're actually maybe getting what they would quite like. Industrialists would say they are definitely benefiting. They don't have to worry about trade unions and wage rates, and they are still able to produce and manufacture goods that can be sold either to the German state, sold to the German people, or sold abroad. So some groups are definitely going to do better than others under this kind of Nazi, new Nazi kind of economic system. Okay, that's all for now. Thank you.